Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hi, folks. It's Rick Wilson. Welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I am absolutely delighted today to be joined by Heather Cox Richardson. She is one of the smartest observers of American politics and democracy. Is the publisher of the phenomenal Substack Letters from an American, which I highly recommend. We are going to talk today a little bit about the closing moves. We're recording this on Friday. This will air on Monday. So whatever craziness happens over the weekend, you're just going to have to ride with us. But we are closing this race out, Heather, in a way where the contrast that I think a lot of us in the pro-democracy movement sort of predicted it would end up. It would be a referendum between a constitutional democracy and an incipient autocracy. And Donald Trump has played the autocracy card more and more and louder and louder as we've closed out this race.
I think that's right. And what I didn't expect coming here at the end was for Trump to be quite so visible in his fascism. I really thought he was going to keep on going with the, oh, I'm not so bad kind of shtick. And in fact, he's really doubled down on the idea that he is a fascist, which is an interesting political decision in the United States of America.
You know, the idea of any candidate having to say, I'm not a fascist.
I am not a crook.
Right. It has a Nixonian kind of air to it. But of any candidate having to say, I'm not a fascist, and then continuing to go out and do all these things, ranging from, the enemies of the people statements where he's going to say, I want to use the military to arrest them, to, as we're recording this on Friday, talking about Liz Cheney standing in front of 9 rifle barrels, which is, as blunt a statement in terms of an authoritarian saying, I'm going to kill my political opponents, as I think we've probably ever heard in our system.
Yeah, well, I think we got to start from the premise that I think you and I agree on, and that's that at this point, Donald Trump's brain is tapioca. I mean, there is.
Oh, yeah.
He's in serious mental crisis, and both, I think, in terms of his acuity, but also in terms of his emotional status and so on and so forth. And I, of course, am not a doctor, but you never want to say I am not. But that being said, I have observed that sort of behavior in elderly friends and relatives as they are in a very fast downhill slide. And he's under an enormous amount of pressure, both politically and socially and financially. And, there's all kinds of that stuff going on as well. But one of the things that I think we're seeing with him, not only in his fascist statements and the Madison Square Garden rally and so on, is a real belief that he could double down on this base. But one of the things that I think is really going to hurt him going forward into these last final days toward the election is that the language that he is using is a very clear threat to women. And it's interesting, after the statement that he made quite late last night about Liz Cheney, there are a number of people out there today saying, well, he didn't really threaten Liz Cheney, because he was talking in a sort of vague way about her father, and then about how she's a war hawk, and then, what would she feel like if there were guns pointed at her. But I think for women, that is the kind of veiled threat that we are very attuned to. And having his surrogates say, well, he didn't really threaten her, just pours gasoline on the fire. And I think that's one of the things that you're seeing right now, is this play out in American society and American voting of this different perception of politics between men and women.
And I do think, we've seen a massive surge in early voting from women. We've seen a massive surge in absentee ballot requests from women. We've seen that not only because of Dobbs, but because of the entire sort of shift in the way the Republican Party looks at women in the Trump era. It's not just Trump, but it is the party more broadly. in terms of their autonomy, in terms of their rights, in terms of how they're treated in public. All that, I think, has added up to a very sort of politically poisonous moment for Trump. And I feel like going into the last weekend of the campaign, talking about executing one of your chief political critics is so distant from American life that it's going to have a political impact. Even as this country seems like it's very polarized, it feels to me like this one's going to cut through because it's so blunt and it's so hard. It's unspinnable.
Well, I have a question for you on that. It certainly feels to me as if, when somebody starts to rocket downhill in social life and also in political life, they go really fast because people who used to be willing to overlook things are no longer willing to do that. And if you're waiting to be insulted by Donald Trump at this point in this campaign, you basically have to take a number because he's managed to offend so many people and to be so violent against so many people that it's a little hard to see anybody even trying to imagine he could dig himself out of the extraordinary anger that he is provoking at this point. People really loathe him. They don't dislike him. They loathe him. And then they just keep doing things like that make it worse.
Yeah, and again, we look at the thankfully in today's modern world, a small number of the N is very small of places like the places where autocracy got close in America, where authoritarianism got close in America. It's a very small set of cases. But I think part of the loathing comes not just because Trump is his personal affect and his behavior is loathsome. I think a lot of this also comes from the fact that at some basal level, people sense that this is a corruption of this country, a corruption of the American system.
I think that's right. And one of the things that has been a real problem for us really since the 1960s, I think, for a number of reasons that were embedded in political science, is that Americans stopped talking about what the principles of democracy looked like. And one of the things that was really dramatic, I thought, in the first impeachment of Donald Trump was when Alexander Vindman stood up and talked about the principles of America. And then Fiona Hill did it. And then Masha Yovanovitch did it. And after that, Adam Schiff in his closing statements in that trial of the first impeachment talked about American principles. And once again, we are talking about those things. And that's going to make, I think, a very different kind of political system going out of this moment, whatever it looks like, because once again, the actual principles of democracy and how you create a government in which people have a say in their government, and we reach some kind of an agreement about what a good procedure for going forward looks like, that's going to be very different than we've seen really since the 1980s, when you got the rise and the embedding in our political system of what became the MAGA party, a group of people who were deliberately trying to game the system, deliberately lying to voters. And it's, I think that's one of the changes we're seeing that is going to make the post-election period look very different than we've seen in many people's lifetimes.
Yeah, I think we all have to be ready for 76 very long and very tough days. Because
yes, I agree with you.
Autocrats and authoritarians are terrific at using the tools of democracy to corrode democracy. And if we're looking at a post-election period where they're going to contest every single state and they're going to contest every single ballot and contest anything that is even vaguely negative for them, I hope that the pro-democracy side of this equation, the Harris campaign, the pro-democracy fighters out there, recognize that these people are in this. This is ride or die for them. They either succeed in this or a lot of them go to jail, and not because the Democrats are going to put them in jail to punish them politically, but because they're trying to commit crimes just like they did in 2020 to overturn a free and fair election. I mean, that to me, I still keep coming back to that. Like I think she's going to have a bigger win than people think, because there are a lot of quiet Republicans who know that the choice of Trump isn't just a choice of Donald Trump. It is a choice to end America as we know it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And not just people are breaking the laws in 2024, but remember there are a bunch of people who asked Trump for a pardon in 2020 who still have those things hanging over their heads. And that, I think, is part of why there'll be such anger and such an attempt to get the election to go their way in whatever way they can. But I think it's also important to remember that the evangelicals who have backed Trump, the white evangelicals who are still riding with Trump, see this as their last chance to put their vision of Christian nationalism into place in what is the strongest nation in the world. It would be a triumph for their God. And the people who think that they are fighting for God historically are people who are not willing to say, oh, oopsie poopsie, I'll try again later, knowing full well that in fact they don't have the support of the vast majority of the American people. And I think you really see this in J.D. Vance. You know, that speech he gave in 2021 where he talked about, you know, being aggressive in their use of power and about how the Christian nationalists had lost all the pillars of American society and they had to be brutal about taking them back and so on. You know, that's not the speech of somebody who says, you know, I'm going to go out in 4 years and try and get more voters. That's somebody who says, I believe that God is on my side, not that I'm on God's side, but that God is on my side and that we have to take it for him. And those people, again, historically, don't back down very easily.
Yeah, and you know, autocracies and dictatorships, they have this sort of corrosive nature to them, and that corrosive nature is in part a product of their persistence. These guys, they don't give up because they lost. They will continue to try these shenanigans, to try these angles, various ways to get to a conclusion that that puts them in power again, because that's the core of what they are. It's not ancillary to what they are. The retention and acquisition of power is the entire operation. It's not persuasion. It's not getting new voters or getting new customers, as we like to say. It's about seizing and holding power. And so they'll come back around no matter what it takes tactically to do that.
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. But I think the other piece of this that I find fascinating is that in the process of simply trying to win by gaming the system because they want to have power in order either to impose their own Christian nationalism or, in Trump's case, to stay out of jail and get as much money as he possibly can.
Right.
They have bled out of the former Republican Party. This is not a Republican Party anymore. It's an authoritarian fascist party. They've bled out all the talented people. So they're trying to put together, I mean, if you even just look at the way they've run this campaign, hell, I could have done a better job running this campaign. And I'm a writer sitting in Maine, and if you think about the fact that what they are really doing at this point is creating this corrupt, kleptocracy of these, frankly, idiots. What's interesting to me is the fact that all the smart people have now left and become anti-Trumpers. And if they start to work together, the former Republicans, the independents, and the Democrats in this large coalition, that's going to split that coalition. I mean, historically, you can't have that big a coalition in American politics, and we need at least two healthy political parties. What's interesting to me is what will happen on the other side, because it sure looks like we could end up with two really quite good parties coming out of this if we leave the MAGAs behind.
I think there's a center right party waiting to be born in this country, and it's not the old Republican Party. It's not the old three-legged stool Republican Party. I think it is more about individual liberty, more about rule of law, constitutional adherence, and less about the sort of what was a free market party became a sort of like, let's take care of the highest bidder party. I know that from the inside. But I think there's a conservative party that's a governing conservative party, not just an oppositional party, which is what MAGA is. It just opposes everything. It just hates the world. But I think that is waiting to be born right now. I think it is. It's not quite a critical mass, and it's not a majority of the current Republicans, but it would be effective enough to put a cross pressure on the Republican Party as it exists today that could deny them majorities anywhere if it was a national party. And I also think Kamala Harris has reshaped the Democratic Party to more to the center. People they're not processing that, but she is.
Well, I find the addition of Tim Walz to the ticket fascinating because he is, of course, now a fervent Democrat and putting forth policies that are seen as Democratic policies. But he is, an absolute echo of progressive republicanism from the middle of the country at the early 20th century. I mean, he is Bob La Follette with a sense of humor because Bob La Follette was like the least, and that marriage of those two ideas and the abandonment of identity politics, which I think Harris and Walz have done really deliberately, is a new Democratic Party. One of the things that interests me is what you just said going forward. There will be entirely new parties on both sides. And what's interesting to me is what they will look like, because we know historically, we saw this in the 1860s, we saw it in the 1890s, we saw it in the 1930s. We know historically that what comes out of this moment will still probably have the labels Republican and Democratic, but the issues will be entirely different. So I'm figuring that climate change is going to work into this, that foreign affairs are going to work into this in new ways. But I literally sit at night and play around and think, if I were creating a new Republican Party right now, what is my platform? And it's not easy to see right now, I don't think.
I think that's right. It is a difficult thing to imagine on the platform side. I think it's less difficult to imagine on the personality side. I mean, you have this very definitional character of the way the Trump Republican Party looks and sounds and feels, and it's always a culture war. It's always the elites against the embattled traditional Americans. It's all a front. It's all a game. But I do think that rhetoric and communication and presentation and leadership still matter broadly. And I think so, the Liz Cheneys of this world, the Adam Kinzingers of this world, and some rising voices, I think, that once Trump is off the stage will come out of the woodwork quickly. I mean, a lot of the reason we face what we face today, Heather, and I'm curious about your thoughts about this, there was a devil's bargain made by Mitch McConnell in particular, right after January 6th, where his consultant said, well, we can't knock Trump out forever because he'll stomp off and take his party with him. And so we can have a permanent governing majority if we just control Trump's voters and build a coalition with them. But that governing majority doesn't exist. They don't want to govern. They want the chaos. They want the authoritarianism. When you look at other democracies that have gone through a period like this, there tends to be, an emergent younger generation, and I think I'm curious if you see that same idea out there.
I was wondering if that's where you were going, because I think that's the other big piece here is that calculation that McConnell made, and certainly the way that Trump is talking now suggests that the way that you garner power in the United States is to go back to the kind of threats that we saw in the 1970s and the 1980s, the idea of a white male majority being threatened by minorities, whether ethnic or racial or religious or gender. And that had enormous resonance, obviously, in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And Reagan very clearly picked that up in his 1980 campaign when he gives the speech right there in Philadelphia, Mississippi, right near where the 3 civil rights workers were found buried in the earthen dam. But, I don't know how old you are. I'm in my 60s. That does not resonate
almost
with the
61.
Next generation.
It does not.
That does not. This whole the gender lines and the racial lines that seemed so natural to people in that era were always constructed, and they simply do not have reality for the next generation. If you watch these young women on TikTok watching Trump's Access Hollywood tape, you can see that they are disgusted, but they are also just like, what? Like how was this ever not a deal breaker?
Right. They can't imagine a world where someone says those words. It stuns them that someone comes out and says those words.
Exactly. I mean, and it's sort of like, if you read the late 19th century or the early 19th century, and you read insults and you read the construction of the way people fight about things. And from our perspective, you're like, what on earth are you fighting over? Like, I don't even understand what you're fighting over, let alone
Right.
being able to take a side. And that going forward in the 21st century with these people who have grown up, in a very different world than you and I did, it's not clear that that there's any way to hammer back together that old version of America that Donald Trump is using. That being said, the other direction I thought you might be going is that they certainly are using all the rhetorical tools and the demographic tools to hold on to power. They simply don't have the numbers, so now they're turning to violence.
As my friend Stuart Stevens says, about 50% of the kids born today are not white. They're from a minority that presently is presently a minority. And as he likes to say, chances are they're going to stay that way. And so if you're not going to have a party that is willing to operate in a way that they understand and that they care about, and with a package of issues that they need to hear about, and it is things. It's not just climate change and gun control and college loans. It's a broader question of their future, the opportunities that will or won't be present for them. I think those kind of things really come down as a meaningful opportunity for the Democrats to solidify this majority, or an opportunity for this emergent, center-right party to solidify this majority,
or to keep them in tension. I mean, the chances that we're going to walk away from where we are now with one majority party that dominates forever it's certainly an option. You can look at the Democrats after the 1930s, and they did that, or the Republicans after the Civil War, they did that. It's also possible to say we're actually going to have two real parties in tension going forward, the way we had in the 1880s after the Democrats jumped off the cliff. So, I don't think we know, but I think it's a really interesting thing. I do think that it's going to make for a very rocky next 6 weeks, though, as we watch the MAGA party die. And honestly, you just said, something about the Republican Party coming out of the MAGA party and the Republican Party. Is there a Republican Party anymore, with Trump having so thoroughly corrupted the Republican National Committee
there's
and
not.
The finances and
It's
got the name. The name is going to stick around, but the email lists are corrupted. The finances are corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
The branding is now poisonous.
Right. They kept the Republican Party elephant logo, but that's not the Republican Party anymore. It's gone now. It simply doesn't exist. No serious person looks at the operational side of the Republican Party now and says, "Wow, they're going to go win a lot of races without a significant transformational moment," because Trump has. You're right. He's poisoned the well. He has changed the character of the party so profoundly that it's impossible to see. It's impossible to see past him if you're somebody who doesn't buy into the full Trump cult, and it's impossible to see past him if you're somebody who does. There is no substitute for Trump. He is sui generis in every way, and the people that love him because they're in the cult, they'll never get a substitute. They will chase the dragon of Trump for the rest of their lives. The people that hate him feel the same way. They think he's sui generis. They hope he's never going to come back. But I worry, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, I worry about a generation of people who, like a J.D. Vance type, who are more able to pretend or to posture like they're from the meritocracy, more normie in their affect and their character, who don't immediately scream out that they're a former game show host and con man. I look at these people and I'm concerned about that.
Well, I'm not concerned about them in terms of their likability. I mean, you look at J.D. Vance. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a vice presidential candidate with lower
No, absolutely
likability
correct.
numbers. He's underwater, and so I worry less about that. I worry, and am actually really interested in what you have to say about the intrusion into our politics of what I would call the elite tech bros. And by that, I don't mean the people simply who have made their fortunes in technology, but those who adhere to the sort of Curtis Yarvin idea that we need to burn down everything so that the tech bros can take us into this, wonderful future. Because, we have seen this repeatedly in American history, where you get a few people with a lot of money who think that they can reorder human society in these really exciting ways. And they're freaking idiots. It is always simply a fantasy on their part.
You mentioned Curtis Yarvin, who's a name that most Americans have never heard of, and yet he's the most dangerous person most Americans have never heard of. Folks, Curtis Yarvin is a Silicon Valley, I'll say the word, I hate this phrase, but he's a thought leader in Silicon Valley who has attracted a bunch of these guys like Peter Thiel and Elon and David Sachs and all these people. And he believes in monarchy, to put it, to trim it down to its most narrow definition. He doesn't believe in American democracy. So I do think having that much money behind bad ideas is a real risk factor for the country. I mean, you look at the influence he has had on people, to basically build out an ideological framework for a post-democratic America, where the tech bros, where the broligarchy, as I like to call it, they end up becoming a new American, an American monarchy, essentially. I find it absolutely terrifying as somebody who believes in the Republic and the Constitution, that this intellectual movement has even taken root, because we really haven't had that particular flavor before of autocratic thinking in this country. We haven't quite gotten to that level.
Well, maybe not to that level. I mean, Andrew Carnegie could have given them a run for their
Sure.
money, but there's a real difference between a monarchy, as you say, or even somebody like Carnegie and these tech bros, because they at least recognize the need to have a relationship with the ruled. That is, there had to be some way, some idea of noblesse oblige or something. And the tech bros, really, if you listen to the way Musk is talking now with his strong backing of Donald Trump, the idea that we are going to have to go through this terrible 2 years of hardship in order to return the country to what he considers a legitimate economic base. It's like that cartoon of the prince saying, this is a lot of you are going to die, but I'm okay with this. It's not a recipe for actually a governance system. It's a recipe for a very few, I think, very intellectually and emotionally immature men to impose their fantasy on a hell of a lot of people. And that 100%. Never goes well. You don't turn the country over to fifth graders and say, I know you have this utopian idea, put it in place. And now we've created these people who have billions of dollars and who can not necessarily put their vision into place. I'm not thinking that all of Musk's experiments look real good, but they can corrupt our politics to the point that we can put the power of the United States government behind them. And that, I think, is a really dangerous proposition, and one that, because there are so few of them and they are so extraordinarily wealthy, it hasn't hit the national political consciousness the way, for example, white evangelical radicals has done.
And they couch it in a kind of, well, we make all the beautiful things that you enjoy so much. We make these products that are innovative and smart and accomplished, and Americans do love technology. We stare at our phones 12 hours a day. We exist in a matrix of social media things that these guys built. And it feels to some Americans like, well, they must be smart. They're billionaires. They must know something. They're billionaires. And there's an old trope in particularly in Republican, but in independent voters as well, where they've said over and over again, I want a businessman leading the country. We need a businessman in the White House. And look, we know how that's worked out with Trump. He wasn't really a businessman to begin with. So, the things that have happened haven't changed a lot of the views, though, of these Republican-based voters. They're not looking at the democracy existential risk, they're still sort of thinking about, why aren't we led by the kind of people that we fantasize about being led by?
Yeah, and the United States government is not a business, and the businessmen when we put business people in charge of it, it hasn't historically done very well. The real thing that gives me some hope in this is that in other periods of time, when our leaders and our voters and the people who are non-voters have insisted on a government that actually serves the good of the people, and they have managed to populate the media sphere with that kind of belief about America, but Americans have gotten behind it in huge numbers. So if you think about the period after World War II, for example, the liberal consensus swept in Democrats and Republicans and independents all, and really was a very stable governing coalition for a long time until it got upended. And there's no reason we couldn't do that again.
Yeah, I mean, that idea that we have that we have precedent for stable bipartisan governance in this country, I think is something that's gotten sort of washed away. A lot of people I don't know if they forgot about it, or they just look at today's world and can't believe it, because it really was a world that was much different in terms of and I think I was present at the very end of it when I worked in the first Bush administration, in 41's administration. It was the end of the Cold War, and I can remember going on CODEL trips to, during the drawdown of the nuclear weapons programs and all that stuff. And it was, Republicans and Democrats side by side. It was Dick Lugar and Joe Biden. It was, they may have differed ideologically, but they looked at the assignment and said, wow, we've got to protect our country in this very chaotic, strange moment. And they did. And it didn't strike them at the time as like, oh, I'm making some deep compromise. It was like, they're doing the right thing.
Well, I would say they were not different ideologically in that period so much as different in terms of approach and policy, whereas now we really have highlighted and empowered a different ideology than American democracy in this country, which is fascism. And This is what this election is all about. Are we going to give up that idea of democracy around which people from Democrats, Republicans, Whigs, know-nothings, we could go down the whole historical list, have rallied in our almost 250-year-old history? Or are we going to turn everything over to a kleptocracy led by an autocrat? And I think when people understand the stakes, they're pretty clear that while some people really do want that, some people really do want what they consider their avenger taking revenge on people like you and me, the vast majority of Americans really like the guardrails of our democracy. And the thing that I wish we talked more about is the degree to which the guardrails of democracy underpin world trade, because the minute you get rid of the freedom of the seas and the rules that are protecting container ships, for example, you just can't even imagine what life in America is going to look like. And that's gotten almost no press in this election.
The combination of a lawless post international, rule of law order, plus a global regime of massive tariffs. I mean, Trump is seriously at that point really talking about something that would utterly destroy the American and global economy, for that matter.
Yes, and people, I think, are so accustomed in America to being able to say, well, we're such a big country, we can do whatever we want, because they forget that it is those international rules of order that enable ships to travel across the oceans, which, you think in the 21st century, the idea of shipping being so incredibly important, it's one of those things I don't think people think about, but virtually everything that comes to the United States of America comes in container ships. You get rid of the container ships because, China decides it doesn't like us in a week, and you think the shortages of the pandemic were bad. Oh, just wait to see what those supply chain troubles are going to cause.
My friends.
Yeah. And that, that comes down to so much of understanding the world and the way we teach it, because most people don't even think about ocean trade and the world, for all the fact we're in this new era of rockets and satellites and all that, still depends on ocean trade.
I really believe that technology has been a great boon for mankind, and Americans have benefited more than most. But there is a point where, like, a reality check about what we really are, where we really live, the world as it is, not the one as people imagine it, is something we haven't been terribly good at for the last few years. and I'm hoping we're gonna refocus on that a little bit as the next couple of years in this what I hope to be a pretty meaningful reset period take place.
Well, one of the things that the extraordinary invention of the internet has done, and I have likened it to fire, is that it has enabled the dissemination of disinformation at a level that we have never seen before. We've always had some level of disinformation, but
Sure.
the fact that you can spread it the way you can nowadays is a real problem. And that has, of course, perverted our legacy media. Now, there's all kinds of new media coming up that I think is much more in the line of old-fashioned newspapers coming from the bottom up, or broadcasts coming from the bottom up, that are pushing back against that. But one of the things we simply must do going forward from the 2024 election is address the disinformation campaigns that are really literally declaring war on American democracy. And, there are ways to do that without impinging on the First Amendment, getting rid of the algorithms that privilege right-wing speech, getting rid of the bots and the trolls. Those are all achievable things that would not intrude on the First Amendment, which is so vitally important to democracy. And that's simply something that must be front and center, because you can't continue to have a democracy when almost 50% of your people are operating in a fantasy world, not because they intended to be there, but because what they consider news has sold to them a world that doesn't exist.
It is. I always think about this. We face this really complex, interlocking series of challenges in the post-Trump era. And Heather Cox Richardson, you are a fascinating observer of these things, deeply knowledgeable. Folks, I strongly recommend her amazing Substack, Letters from an American. It will keep you thinking and keep you historically grounded in a lot of the things that we're about to face. And again, Heather, I'm deeply grateful for you coming on this last recording of the podcast before the election. Folks, this will be out on Monday, so if we've missed anything or if something crazy happens over the weekend, we're taping this about Friday, so just give us a little grace on that point. Anyway, Heather, thanks again. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. Let's get something really fucking clear, Donald. The idea that you want to execute Liz Cheney may play to your base and your enormous claque of idiot followers. I said it, idiot followers, because you know exactly what you're saying. You know what you're doing. You're trying to raise the political temperature on Liz Cheney so she gets killed. This is what autocrats do. I wouldn't expect anything less from you, but I hope for some moment, I hope for some tiny fraction of a second, somebody around you says, hey, don't talk about Liz Cheney being executed. That's not cool. I hope somebody does that. I know you won't, because you have no ability to ground yourself or to think in any way other than your personal aggrandizement and your own bullshit. So, folks, I'm recording this on Friday. There's going to be something crazy happen this weekend. It's inevitable. Stick with us. Get out there and vote. You're going to be hearing this on Monday. I want you to promise yourself. There are no excuses now. Your one vote could decide the future of this country. Your one vote, and I mean literally your one vote. It is going to be that close in some of these places. Don't take it for granted. We have a moment here that is going to be vital for the future of this country. You are going to play a vital part in it. Please get out and vote. Thanks, folks. We'll talk to you after the election.